Septerra Core is a computer RPG with turn-based combat that is a JRPG-style game made by a Western dev long before this practice would become a staple of niche indie games 20 years later. I don't think this got the attention it should have gotten when it was released, since it looked very much like a console game of the time, but it was on a PC. So I think there was a bit of confusion as to who the game was meant for. But that's why I'm here, to shine a light into the depths of computer gaming history and ask the question, is it a classic? If this is the first time on my channel, welcome. I am Steven Hansen's geek culture analyst Septerra Extraordinaire. I bring you RPG, strategy and city builder reviews. Please don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy what follows. If you're already a subscriber, welcome back, and remember to click that bell button, it really helps a lot. Septerra Core is set in a world that blends sci-fi with fantasy. Septerra being an artificially created planet made up of 7 distinct layers that all gravitate around an ancient and mystic core, with a spine going through the center of it all, looking something like an armillary sphere, all of which being created by what are considered to be gods. While there is most evidently advanced technology and robotics on the various layers, or shells as they're called, there's also a magic system powered by the energy given out by the core. Technology and magic seem to work fairly well one alongside the other, and nobody really questions it, so I guess we shouldn't either. This sort of setting does go fairly hand in hand with the very anime-esque art direction of the game. You'll notice it in the designs of the eyes, the hairstyles and general subplots as well. You're playing as Maya, a blue-haired gun-toting junker from Shell 2, which seems to be the rocky desert type shell, who gets embroiled in a world-threatening plot. Along your adventure, you'll visit all the shells and pick up party members as you go. You'll be limited to having only 3 members at any one time, and you will need to have particular members in your party at various junctions in the game to further the story, as well as access certain side areas. When it comes to progressing the story, they will tell you outright they have to be in your party. When it comes to accessing locked parts of the game, that's more of a puzzle solving situation. Because the game does have some adventure game type minor puzzle solving implemented. Generally the solutions are rather obvious, but this does lead to a certain amount of backtracking to be done, because you'll need to change your party makeup in order to implement the solutions. When interacting with NPCs, you will have a series of subjects to ask them about as Maya, but you can always ask them things with your companions as well. They will only have one thing to ask or say, but depending on who is in your party, having them interact with the NPCs can either result in fights in certain story-related circumstances, or more often in receiving some free items, especially if you have lead in the party. The dudes in Septerra must really like blondes. With the planet being made up of 7 distinct shells, it allows for a lot of variety to be had in terms of settings and backgrounds, and the game delivers. You get everything from the traditional catacombs and cities, but also dirt road villages, dry deserts, snowy mountains, and all manner of canyons, caves, forests and jungles. The amount of time and work that must have gone into making these had to be insane, and I appreciate it a lot. What I don't appreciate that much is the respawning enemies, and I know this is a very personal taste subjective sort of thing, but when I'm super engrossed in a story that has you doing some backtracking, having to fight the same things that you've just fought 5 minutes earlier puts a big damper on my enjoyment levels. On the one hand, you get experience, sure, but on the other hand, you also use up resources, and most importantly, the fights take a lot of time, and I mean a lot of time. And this is by far the game's biggest issue, that could have been arguably solved in the easiest of ways. Combat is horribly slow. At its base, it's a continuous turn-based system similar to Final Fantasy VII and other JRPGs. The characters have a sort of power bar that fills up to 3 stages, allowing each character a variety of low, medium and maximum attacks. This in itself is totally fine. It makes for a very dynamic combat experience since you have to juggle various timings with the use of different abilities. This isn't where the combat is slow though. It's slow when it comes to everything between you waiting for the power bar to fill and selecting an attack and then the attack actually happening. Generally, all the melee characters involved in a fight will jump to attack each other, then go into the attack animation and then jump back to their places. This takes longer than you'd think, because the same thing happens when enemies attack as well, and there's a fair few melee characters. Fights with several enemies tend to take an even longer time, especially if the enemies heal themselves. This excruciating slowness of the combat encounters, coupled with the respawning of enemies, makes for a lot of time being literally wasted waiting for animations to happen. And don't even get me started on the time required to do more complex magical summons. Just look at this. I'm gonna let this run in real time. All of this could have been cut down if the devs had included a combat speed setting or a toggle of sorts to either speed up or skip the animations and simply have the damage be dealt without the melee characters having to move, or similarly have the ranged characters fire off their weapons faster. A couple of seconds here and there would go a long way towards making the overall gaming experience more fluid. The other issue, more related to the game's age than design choices, is the very small resolution and the fact that you cannot scroll the screen without moving the character. This takes some time to get used to, and you can sort of deal with it once you learn the layout of the areas, but playing it now, it's more than a pain. The game would not only look great in higher resolutions, but would also play much faster. Thankfully, it does have a map button, so you can use that to help you guide your steps towards the map exits. So what is one to do with a 20-year-old game that desperately needs some quality of life changes and that hasn't been modded because the engine was proprietary from a developer that never made anything else? One cheats. Yeah, one cheats. Yes, Septerra Core comes from an era when developers would put in various cheat codes in games to make them easier, funnier, or goofier, as opposed to having you pay for those features in the form of microtransactions. And quite surprisingly enough, at least some of the features that the cheats enable should have been part of the game settings. There is really one main code I use to allow me to go through the combat encounters faster. It is one which allows you to see the enemy's HP and power bar. It's not as good as literally speeding up animations or cutting them outright, but it does allow you to see which of the enemies is building up to their max attacks, and also allows you to decide which one should be focused down first. There's another code that will instantaneously win an encounter and also reward you with the full XP and loot. This one is to be used if you're really interested in going through the game to see the story, or if you're finding yourself having to backtrack through a freshly respawned area. There's even a code that allows you to scroll the image without having to move your party, although I have not managed to make that one work. So having these things as implemented but hidden parts in the game really makes me ponder why they weren't part of the general game settings to begin with. But now cometh the question, what maketh a video game a classic? Some would say it's subjective, some would say it depends, and there's definitely something to be said about subjective classics, which is something I'll talk about after the next paragraph. But in order for a game to be an objective classic, it has to be considered to be good over a period of time, has to be remembered as such, and also it has to stand up to current day scrutiny. And I also consider that 10 years is the minimum period required for such a hindsight-based judgment to take place. In this case, it's been 20, so we're fine in that respect. Septerra Core is my very first super hardcore example of a subjective classic. Obviously for me, hence the subjective. And I'd like to go into it a little bit deeper because you need to understand the context of why that is. I feel and think that Septerra Core was a much bigger deal in my neck of the woods for several reasons. Let's start with some background info and look at how Septerra Core is seen in the mainstream gaming world. Take a look at its Wikipedia page, for instance. This is it. And here's the Wikipedia page for Disciple Sacred Lands, which I just covered, and this one is for Pharaoh, which is coming up, both being games that were released at the same time as Septerra Core. There's a marked difference in awareness of the title and as far as mainstream audiences are concerned. So why was it a much bigger deal for me? Septerra Core was heavily featured in one of the handful of Romanian video gaming magazines at the time, a magazine called Level. This is a preview of the game from May of 1999. The game would be released at the end of October. This is the February 2000 issue, in which Septerra Core has both a review and a walkthrough. And then in June of 2002, the same magazine came bundled with the full game. So this was a game that they had talked about for a long time and in a lot of detail, and now it was available to play. Also, bear in mind, back then in Romania, I would guesstimate that roughly 95% of computer video games were being pirated, at the least. So having a full official game for a super low price was a bit of a feel good about yourself thing as well. So this is why I think Septerra Core is a game that many of us growing up as gamers back then and there played. And despite the obvious problems it has, looking back at it now, its core experience of an anime type story and characters is still quite enjoyable, but it definitely cannot stand up to modern day equivalents. Septerra Core is most definitely not an objective classic. It could have been one if all the mechanical issues I outlined throughout my video would have been fixed, but since that never happened, it just cannot be an objective classic. It is, however, most definitely a subjective classic for yours truly. And I'd really like to get a discussion going in the comments for this one, because I am extra curious to hear what you think about Septerra Core. Depending on where and when you come from, I'm curious to know what your awareness and experience with the game is, if any. Where does it fit in your personal gaming history? Thank you very much for watching. I've been Steven Nonsense, and see you next time.